Hey, welcome back. Hope you had a good time talking about your stories. There was some impact there and some experiences maybe you'll never forget. One thing we think about when not just sharing our stories with each other, but finding the right time and the right place and the right people to actually share our story and the story of Jesus with them. And it's important to know when a good time is, when to kind of have your antennas up and your ears open and your heart to the people and the environments around you. And just kind of thinking about some situations in our lives, maybe in everyday relationships. I think the most important thing, and you guys might agree, is to do so in relationships. Mm-hmm. To get to know people, to love them where they're at, and to become friends with your neighbors, people at work, and then to just kind of be aware of the situations in their life in which you can love them first. And then as you love them, maybe to influence them in the right direction or the direction of Jesus. One of those opportunities might be commonalities, like maybe you have things in common. I mentioned earlier today about sports and music and movies. We've talked about those are great conversation openers. Maybe it's crisis, a time in life when they're going through a hard time, and you can connect with them, relate to them in that way, and share Jesus with them. Can you think of a good time where, or a situation where this might be a great time to connect your story, God's story, to a person's story that you're doing life with?
I think when people are experiencing brokenness, they're just a lot more willing to hear a real solution, and I think our story is that real solution. I think they're a lot more inclined to be willing to listen to that story at that point.
So brokenness meaning maybe a season of pain.
Well, it could be a loss. Mm-hmm. It could be that they've just hit rock bottom. We throw out those kind of words, but that's the kind of brokenness, the crisis that you would expect to see in someone's life, to where they're really ready for some sort of change. They're ready for a change.
Yeah.
I think when people have children too, maybe people you've been trying to connect with when before kids, I think when they're holding that baby in their hands, just something clicks in their life and they realize that they're responsible for more than just themselves.
Right, it's a good crisis.
That could be another crisis, but it's a great time to try to connect.
Yeah, that's kind of a major life transition. Having kids. We really promote marriage before having kids. That would be another transition
so does the
time.
Bible.
Marriage.
The Bible teaches that. So marriage is another one. Maybe another.
Well, you're talking about crisis and transition, and those are things why your testimony is so important, because if you have light ground, as you mentioned, you can talk like that. Yeah. But I really look for those people that are asking spiritual questions, that they're hungry. They're, like you mentioned, hungry earlier. You were hungry, you had lots of questions, and you were asking people. And that's a true sign of, hey, I'm willing to change or try something new. So I look for that too.
Yeah, what if you don't have the answers, Patrick? Like, what if I come to you with a spiritual question and you kind of don't know how to answer? Like, it's in the moment. What do you do?
Yeah, well, I like to invite somebody back for a later meeting so that I can do some homework on that. I have no problem not knowing the answers. And I'm going to encourage you to feel that same way. Nobody has all the answers, but I would encourage a later meeting, a get back together, a cup of coffee, or a meeting at a house or something like that.
I agree. And you've got a whole resource center here, and I don't just mean like the library resource center, but the people resources of this church community that you can turn to, right? And you can say, hey, I'm not sure, but I'd love to talk to you about this. Let's go find out some answers.
Sure.
And when you recognize that someone is willing to have that spiritual conversation, or to at least start to share stories, I think there's a starting place, and there's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's because listening becomes the most important thing that you can start off with. I think we have a tendency to want to, this person will let me say a bunch of words, and then you say all of the words that you know on the first meeting.
Back the truck on them, right?
And that doesn't seem to, work that much. And so to ask just short questions and get them to start to feel comfortable sharing with you. Again, this is the beginning of building relationships, but I've known some people that could ask just 2 or 3 questions over the course of an evening and give a person plenty of time to share as much of their life with you as they're willing. And so being able to listen, kind of track the conversations, look for key topics that maybe you can go back to. Like, don't interrupt them in the middle of the story, but keep actively listening in a way that you can remember, ooh, I'm going to go back to when they mentioned this about their family or this about a relationship. But it starts with listening.
Absolutely.
Great point. Another thing I love to do is talk about growing the relationship. The people really, the old saying, they need to know how much you care long before they care how much you know. And so we have to earn the right to talk about Jesus with them. We have to build that bond with them. And, I think sometimes, like Jeff mentioned, we get out there and we start talking about us, and that's not including them into our lives. We need to have that sacrificial love that Jesus had for us. In fact, when somebody came to you and was sharing, Joe, you mentioned your friend in high school, he loved you. He showed you his love long before he talked about Jesus, and you knew something was different about him. So I think that's the huge point of that, right?
Yeah, relationship was grown, in a process of months, weeks, until we could actually have some gut, level conversations and ask questions. And it's funny because Mark, even though he was introducing me to Jesus and to the youth group, there were other people around. I think I mentioned that earlier, where I could answer questions, and they were willing to have relationships with me. One of the most powerful things I remember as a teenager was going to some of my friends' houses, and one in particular whose mom and dad were there, and to see an older Christian couple living this out in front of me, and then to be able to sit down and they invested in me too.
Wow.
It wasn't just my high school friend, and they would ask me questions about my family and about school, and and any questions that I might have,
And you knew they were going to love you whether you chose Jesus or not,
Yeah.
because they were using the power of Jesus.
honestly, I didn't know that.
Really?
No, because when you grow up not knowing that's the way things ought to be, you don't know that's the way things are until you're in the middle of it. And it was trial and error. I had to mess up, and they were, they kept loving me through that. That's how I learned that they would love me through it. It was interesting.
I think at the end of the day, too, what they were doing was asking your permission. Whether they asked you in so many words or not, they were
Right.
investing in you. And at some point, you gave them the green light to talk about Jesus longer than,
Yeah, and that's what
superficial
relationships
stuff.
are, really. I think there's times when even your kids wonder, will mom and dad love me after what I've done? They even doubt, but you do. And as you do, and you just keep layering that, and loving them through those situations. I mean, I don't know, Jeff, how you share your story with your kids growing up, but I bet you there's times where even in your own house with all that's going on, the relationship grows through trials.
It does, and I think we've focused on when we mess up, that's a good teaching opportunity, but also when your kids do something right. And
right.
like
Praise them, yeah.
catch them doing something good, and actually you don't have to only use crisis and the trials. You can also say, hey, when you just did that good thing for your brother or for your friend, like the reason why we do that is this, and then that becomes a conversation with them.
I feel like one of the words, we haven't mentioned it yet, but the word that a lot of this revolves around is influence, right? And influence we only get relational influence by having relationship, by showing love, by being there in those hard moments, by being there in those good moments, right?
Right.
And we grow in our influence with that person, and that gives us permission.
Right.
I mean, influence is that permission to speak into somebody else's life, but that isn't usually it's not gonna happen the first time we meet someone. We don't have influence at that point.
Got to make friends first, yeah. They
Yeah.
know how much you care. And what that'll end up doing is giving you the ability to look for your opportunities. Where do you work? Where do you go to the restaurant often? Which grocery store? Everywhere you go, I don't believe you're there by mistake. God has placed you there to look for that opportunity for somebody who may be hurting, going through a crisis, who may be willing to ask some spiritual questions if you got to know them. So where in your lives do you have that opportunity? If you guys can think of a spot right now where you just know people that don't know who Jesus is.
Well, I've heard it over the years, and probably you have too, of someone from church saying that, well, all my friends are Christians, and I go from my house to the church where they believe everyone in the building is a Christian, which isn't always the case, and then they might use a drive-through window, or they might use self-checkout, and that's actually deleting all the opportunities to talk to people.
Good point.
And so I hear that sometimes that's a person's struggle, but honestly, every restaurant you walk into, every checkout line that you're in, these are all opportunities. And again, over time, this isn't just a one-time thing, but over time, we've heard stories where relationships have been built with cashiers or waiters waitresses, and all of these. It's like every bit of life is an opportunity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you got to be prayed up looking for him. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to start your day off in prayer with God so that he gives you the right words and he opens your eyes to the opportunities that are just around you everywhere right now, much less looking for more, you know.
Absolutely. So I hope these tips that we talked about, that they'll get you started in this idea of you're able to share your story. You really can. And the exercise, the challenge that we've got for you this week is called the My Story Timeline. You're going to find this on page 69 of your Basics Handbook. And in here, it's going to ask those 3 questions that you've already talked about today. You know, who was I before Jesus? What circumstances led to me encountering Jesus? And what transformation, what kind of change is actually happening in my life since then? It's going to walk you through that. You're going to just write down some statements. And listen, this is important because next week what you're going to be doing when you come back together is you're going to be sharing your story together. You're going to be sharing your story with the group that you're with. So make sure that you take some time, consider these questions deeply this week, and figure out what your story is and how Jesus is doing a transformational work in your life. And next week when we get back together, you'll get the opportunity to share that story. See you then.